Okay, so next up, I'm excited to introduce an esteemed panel of panelists for our session, Improving Government Services Through Evaluation, a State and Local Perspective. So first of all, we have Marianne Bates, who is the Executive Director of California's Office of Cradle-to-Career Data. And Marianne also has the honor of being Executive Director of JPAL North America back in the day, and also helped to launch her office 10 years ago, basically. And we also have Kim Desmond, who is the Chief Race and Equity Officer for the City of San Diego. Elizabeth Linos, who is the Emma Bloomberg Associate Professor of Public Policy and Management at the Harvard Kennedy School. She's also the Faculty Director of the People Lab. And then finally, Stan John, who will be our moderator today, is a Senior Program Officer of Economic Mobility and Opportunity at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So take it away.
Great. Good to see you all. Hope everyone's doing good post-lunch. We'll try our best to keep this engaging, entertaining, and for the next 60 minutes or so, we're going to be focused in on how do we improve government services through research. So as Vincent mentioned, my name is Stan John, Senior Program Officer with the Bill and Melinda Gates Economic Mobility Team. We're a relatively new team at the foundation, focusing in on improving the lives of a focused population of folks who live 200% below the poverty line, so that's about 50 million individuals within the US, and improving long-term mobility and long-term growth for that group. So we're going to be focusing in on today that topic of how can research, or rigorous research, improve government services and practices. We want to pass it off to our panel today to also give a quick introduction. Elizabeth, can I pass it over to you?
Sure, absolutely. It's so great to be here. My name is Elizabeth Linos, as you heard. I had the really just good fortune and privilege of working for JPAL straight out of college, and that's obviously changed my career in many ways, and so I feel like a JPAL baby, and it's nice to be back with my cousins and friends and aunties. I'm currently, as you heard, an associate professor at the Kennedy School, and I run a team called the People Lab. And the purpose of the People Lab is really to do rigorous research on the people of government and the communities that they're called to serve. So we do research in partnership with government agencies in three big buckets. One bucket is around the people, so how do you recruit, retain, and support people who work in government with a particular focus on frontline workers. Then we have the second bucket of research that is around improving resident-state interaction. So we think a lot about how to make it easier for people to access government benefit programs, how to destigmatize government services, and what that means in practice. And then we have this third bucket of research, which we call reimagining evidence-based policymaking, which tries to take a step back and say, okay, so we have this good research in the middle, the RCT, what happens before and after? So on the front end, how do we make sure that the people who are most impacted by government services and government innovation are in the room to define what success looks like, to co-design interventions, and then once we have that evidence, how do we think from a behavioral perspective about adoption at scale? So how do we make sure that policymakers are able to use evidence at scale? And I'll stop there.
Delighted to be here. I spent a decade of my career learning and growing here at JPAL, and so it's just been wonderful to be back and to see all of the amazing work that all of you here are moving forward. One of the highlights of my time at JPAL North America was building our state and local innovation work, working with state and local governments, and so it's been really fun for the last year and a half to be on the other side of the table, now with the state of California. So I'm the executive director of the California Cradle-to-Career data system. It's brand new. We're very fortunate to be championed both by our governor and by the legislature with a permanent line item in the state budget and 26 civil service positions authorized for it. So what are we doing? The vision of the data system is to support evidence-based decision-making with a focus on advancing equity and advancing opportunity for California's young people. And we're doing that in a couple of ways. So one is by bringing together linked data across more than a dozen state entities that will be linking at the individual level, initially for more than 10 million Californians. And our hope in doing so is to make it a lot easier for families, for policymakers, for researchers to be able to use that data and have it actually inform decision making. And then the second part of our work is that we're tasked with bringing to scale some practical tools for students and families, specifically focused on the transition from high school to college. And this is in part the answer to one of the early questions I got in one of our sessions where we're engaging with members of the public, and the question went something along the lines of, are you just getting data to admire the problem better, or are you going to do something about it? So I'm glad that we have that practical component to it too. And then the third aspect of our work, which is new and just announced in an executive order a few weeks ago, is that we've been charged with creating something called the California Career Passport, where we're aiming to make it easier for people to demonstrate skills and support skills-based hiring in ways other than a four-year degree. So that's what we're focused on in California.
Kim Desmond here. I am the Chief Race and Equity Officer for the City of San Diego. And I sit at the purview, my department sits in the mayor's office. And so I have the luck of operationalizing equity across local government, policies, practices, and budget decisions. So essentially what that will look like is, what does your government do for you? And so my favorite words are evidence-based policy and practices. And so I thrive in that area to say our job is to make sure the local government is responsive to delivering the services and the programs to 1.4 million folks. And so my role is to advise the mayor and our COO, operation officer, around ways that we can do that across over 30 departments and over 13,000 city employees. So no small task, which is why I'm always partnering with academic folks to help me think through using evidence-based practices to address complex issues in government services.
Great, thank you. So, Elizabeth, to kick us off, what do you see as some of the top priorities for research within this space that we're hoping to improve upon?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I don't want to repeat myself. Obviously, I chose the areas to work on because I think they're really important. But I do think that there's some common themes that we've seen coming out of the pandemic that seem to keep coming up. One of them is to really think about how we can reframe how we do government services to be more, you can call it resident-centric, user-centric, participant-centric. Really think about what it would mean if we redesigned our policies with that in mind and with our services in mind, and to bring in kind of the equity lens that has been missing in that conversation to the forefront of the conversation. Researchers have a really important role in that we've all been trained to show average treatment effects, and my sense is that that's not good enough anymore. We have to start thinking about how services affect people differently, and that's going to be, I think, a priority for the future. And then the other big area is, once we have all this research, and JPAL North America has been so critical in producing that research for the past 10 years, we're now at this really exciting time where we can say, okay, how do we make sure that local government can use that research? And that can mean a whole bunch of things in terms of adoption at scale. We don't really have as good crisp research answers to that question as we do for the original kind of program evaluation or impact evaluation studies we've done. So I'm excited that this community can be kind of at the forefront of that.
It's interesting you say that, because I think even right before we were going up, we were talking about how do we replicate? How do we think about scale here? And how do we think about and manage kind of short-term versus long-term projects? And then we have different funders and different organizations with goals they're trying to hit in the short term. How do we kind of balance that with efforts that sometimes just take a long time and just takes patience to kind of get this research done well?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. My sense is, when you're in grad school, or at least when I was in grad school, I was told you absolutely don't want to do an RCT. That is a really high-risk strategy. It's a bad idea. Don't do it. Maybe after tenure. And there's some. Clearly, I didn't hear the memo, but I think there's some truth to the fact that doing one-off projects is not only really, really hard and really kind of cost prohibitive for a lot of people, but it's also very risky. And I think what JPAL has offered and what, one potential solution to this problem is to think about this as a portfolio. So yes, no academic has an incentive to do one replication or to do one study at a time, because if it fails, you've wasted 5 years of your life. But if we're thinking about this from a portfolio perspective and saying, we really want to tackle this issue and we're willing to try different interventions across the country or replicate this really promising idea across a whole bunch of different contexts, we're answering a slightly different question, but it's also de-risking that strategy for all the people who are kind of involved in doing this evidence-based work.
Great. Kim, Marianne, in terms of the main topics and then also kind of thinking short-term, long-term, how have you kind of approached your work? And Marianne, specifically, kind of having been on both sides of this very recently, how have you kind of thought about this?
So in terms of priorities, the work that I'm doing right now is very specifically focused on education access, on equity, and I think the question of whether we're preparing people to earn living wages is really central to a lot of the work that we're doing. And so that's kind of the specific policy area where I sit, and I think I was actually thinking back to when I first joined JPAL in 2010. I think that was just as JPAL was starting to organize its work in sectors and in programs. And there's a lot of wisdom in not just approaching this work as saying, like, shouldn't there be more evidence? We should just look for an opportunity to do an experiment wherever it is. Like, that's not how you're approaching the work, right? It's about answering specific targeted questions that align with and resonate with decision makers and policymakers who have things they need to get done and promises they're being held accountable for. So I think that's kind of big picture. One cross-cutting theme that I have seen resonate both in the work I'm doing now and where I was right before this at the Office of Management and Budget is this concept called administrative burden. There's a book by that title by Hurd and Moynihan, and the basic idea is essentially that there are hassles that we as government should bear and not push onto people. And that concept, that framework has resonated a lot with my colleagues across government as kind of a unifying theme that cuts across lots of different policy areas. So I've really seen that resonate. The second part of your question was about this one-off versus long-term piece. And it's really interesting how quickly my perspective on this shifted as soon as I had moved from being here at JPAL to initially being at OMB and now in California. It's incredibly risky to partner with an outside entity when you're sitting within government. It's risky to the institution. It's also risky to you as an individual because things can go sideways and you don't get in trouble for saying no or not doing something, right? Having approved the project, having signed off on it, having signed off on doing something new and innovative, that's the risk. And so I just want to give a special shout out to all of the public servants who take on that risk both institutionally and as individuals and do it. And a really important part of that is because it's so risky, but also so important, is that this idea of doing things one-off doesn't make nearly as much sense, right? There's a reason why when I was at OMB, we were able to pull off a government-wide pilot survey of all of the federal workforce in the largest departments and agencies in just a few months. And it's because the People Lab and the Office of Evaluation Sciences had a long-standing established relationship that we were able to jump on and leverage, and it was an already functional, long-standing relationship with high trust that where we were able to get that done. And I see that, now in the work in California too, and we're partnering with some of the same. But I'm long-winded, but I'm going to bring this home in one sentence here, or 2 more sentences. The part that's invisible a little bit sometimes, even in meetings like what we're having today, where we're celebrating what we learned from individual studies and those moments where we changed our mind, is the crucial role of institutions in facilitating that long-term partnership. So the work that JPAL does in raising funding to be able to provide the public good of having stable long-term staff who can share lessons across different studies, who can provide that stability that if a professor goes on leave or loses interest in a project or the research interests change, you have this institution that creates continuity, and that's the stability for the trusting relationship that we can have from inside government and being able to work with those outside. So that's my reflection, as I think about how the massive challenges that, everything we need to get done in the next 3 years in California, I'm looking for opportunities to partner with people on the outside, and cases where you can do that with an established institution that's providing these public goods just makes that a lot easier to do.
Kim, can you talk us through a little bit of how you prioritize specific topics and how that kind of supports the broader goals of the organization, but then also the city and your personal goals as the equity officer?
Yeah, I'll start with saying this is actually, the city of San Diego is my second city. Turns out I like building and implementing equity offices across different states. And so to answer your first part of your question, it's called Dr. Linos. You'll probably laugh at our text messages. It's like a random text from like, how do we do an RCT around this? Call me back. And so like these are real stories. And so to start out, the question around scale and how you prioritize, with this being my second mayoral administration, it was really getting my hands around, when you talk about scale, what is a model for operationalizing equity? And so being this is my second city, worked hard on saying, what is the model for this work when you're looking at over 30 departments? And with an office that's focused on anti-racism by ordinance, I'll just have to just quote Mayor Kim Janey here, where poverty isn't about the individual failure, right? And so when we say words like racism, it doesn't mean race exclusive in terms of it's inequity. It's inequity in assets, it's inequity in programs and policies. And so in my role, how I prioritize and how I move a workforce of over 13,000 and over 30 departments under the mayor is by saying we gotta be planful. And this question around scale is a huge one in terms of there is over 400 cities across the country that's doing equity work. And so this question of scale is one around how do you prioritize the projects. And so this model here, it helps me. So step one is to all my departments, they have what is called a tactical equity plan. And these are the strategies that they deploy to look at policies and programs and decisions more tactically. That's why it's tactical in nature. And so policies happen all the time in practices in local government. As a matter of fact, every Thursday we have a mayor policy meeting. And so it's really about saying, do folks even understand what your government is charged with doing? So the question of scale is one of saying that public utilities, trash pickup, Parks and Rec, all the things, water quality, these things sit in your local government. There are policies that underpin these decisions. And so when you talk about the administrative burden, it's how is the decisions made to make sure that we're responding to the totality of 1.4 million folks. So you have to be very tactical with the way you select a particular policy or practice because they happen all the time. You're not changing the muni code like every day, right? There are more insidious things that are happening on local government level, like how you respond to sidewalk infrastructure, how you respond to like water shut-off policies, right? These are real things that are coming up in local government where with the stop of shutting off water, now there are cities who are across the scale looking at water shut-off policies. How do you handle that? How do you address that? What's the policy? And so how I prioritize is also one of scale of saying we all are dealing in water quality conversations, infrastructure, where we're all one catastrophic break in a water main or a dam that can flood communities. And so I prioritize based on the things that have the most impact to folks, but also the things that we can measure. And so looking at the ways that we can do randomized controlled trials and use evidence-based practice is my centering and my grounding, because it can be kind of unwieldy. So I try to find projects and have our departments follow this model of saying, what is your strategy? What is your budget decisions? And so this model, I'll talk through this more as we keep moving forward, but it can be unwieldy in government structures. But just giving you all, I'll close with this. Across the country, over 400 cities have these same types of offices. So the potential for scale around common projects in local government services is huge.
One question for the group, and please chime in as you see. How do we convince, or how do we outreach to those that are not as convinced as potentially this room is around the use cases and the benefits of this type of research into improving government services? This could be either beliefs, or it could be capacity issues, it could be size issues. What are the different tactics that we can deploy to reach groups that are not as convinced about this type of efforts?
I guess because I work in politics, that may be fitting for me to start out with. I start out with two different binaries. One is the moral obligation. And this is kind of to the partnerships that I've done with Dr. Linos, in that the moral obligation for the level of compassion fatigue for our city employees is huge. And so morally, this is like perhaps in custody deaths, right? And so if I can appeal to the moral obligation around preventing the number of deaths in our local jail system, then I can appeal to that. So there are some folks who it feels good, you don't want to do a societal thing, so that's the moral obligation. The other is the economic obligation. And so the same thing where there is a cost to in-custody deaths, right? There are real lifetime settlements. And so if I can appeal to the moral obligation around addressing and doing an RCT around compassion fatigue for our employees, then I go to the economic imperative for the politician. Only because we're dealing with a $5 billion budget, sometimes the economic implication feels a little bit more movable in terms of what you pay out in terms of government coffers. And so I usually go between those ones where I read the room to say, is this a moral obligation conversation? Well, let's just do the right thing, or is it an economic imperative? And those are the two lanes that I move in with moving the work forward.
I can add to that. One thing that I think, Marianne, you said that I think is strikingly important and under-discussed is just the trust that is built over the years of doing this work properly. And that you have people in government, like both of you now, who are doing God's work in building that narrative within government. So it's not enough to convince one person, it's to convince one person who then has this really important role of getting everybody else in that infrastructure and local government on board, whether it's the mayor or the legal team or the comms team or whoever the case may be. And I just want to give kind of a shout out. When I first met Kim Desmond when she worked in a different city, I was introduced to Kim because somebody else I worked with said, you need to meet Kim. So already we're like building a network of like, these are the people across the country who are doing good work. And Kim calls me, I don't know if you remember this conversation, and says, I'm doing racial equity work. Do you want to evaluate a racial equity training? And I said, sure, but just so you know, all the evidence suggests that racial equity training doesn't work. And to her credit, she didn't shut the phone. She said, okay, well, let's figure out what does work. And to me, that is just kind of an incredible privilege to be able to work with leaders like Kim and like Marianne, who have enough trust in kind of the evidence-based making process to be able to be an ambassador for that work. And that's led to all sorts of different projects. And then through both of them, I found other projects, building that network where our goal as researchers is to be useful to people who are doing the work. And people in local government are willing to kind of take a chance on evidence creation is really just a process of building trust, which is not taught in grad school. And it's not built in a day, but I think is really critical for getting this work done.
The one thing I'll add to that is I think there's a real opportunity for storytelling and careful choices about the language we use to make a big difference on this front. So we were just chatting over lunch about this. One of the advisory board members for a data system is Dr. Chris Nellum at the Ed Trust West, and I take notes every time we're on a panel together on what words he uses to describe this. And Ed Trust West does something they call data equity walks, where they're in communities. They're based in Oakland and other parts of California, where they're in communities and helping people really connect the idea of data to the things that matter to them in their lives. And so one example we were just talking about is, disaggregating data and the importance of that. And the phrase you use is, this is about you, right? That's another way of saying disaggregating the data. And the more that we can make sure that we're listening first, and then being very thoughtful about how we use storytelling and how we use language, I think that can make a big difference in the openness and trust building that needs to surround all of this work as well.
We want to switch topics a bit and talk about how we incorporate racial equity and meeting community needs into this research. So, Elizabeth, I can ask you, how can researchers work with government agencies just broadly to advance racial equity?
I mean, this is the million-dollar question. I've learned a lot from working with Kim and her leadership in this space to even notice that even though the topic of racial equity, and especially since 2020 has come to the forefront of a lot of local government conversations, this is an area where we don't actually have a lot of good research and a lot of good evidence of what works. And in some ways, initially it felt antithetical, right, to this kind of moral need to say, okay, but we also want to test what works. One thing that Kim has done in the cities that she's worked, and I know other people are thinking about doing as well, is to really think about all social services from an equity lens. So rather than saying you have kind of a racial equity office that works on training or only works on internal equity and inclusion issues, the cities where I've seen this done well are saying, okay, how do we become an inclusive city, both for our own employees, but also for the people that we're serving? And so, when COVID hit, having that lens meant changing what projects we were working on. We did a project in Denver with Kim's team that was on rental assistance. And you might think that's not an equity project, but in fact was led by the equity team in the mayor's office, because the consequences of rental assistance have disproportionate impacts. And we were able to test different ways of destigmatizing rental assistance to increase applications. And so there's like a main effect that's great. Like we got more people to apply for rental assistance at a time that was really critical. But because we were using this equity lens, the intervention we chose was one around destigmatizing the program. It's actually exactly what the mayor said in her keynote. The main intervention was saying, it's not your fault if you need this additional help. And we see that shifts the demographics of who applies. So we significantly increase the number of brown and black households that are applying for this program. So you have kind of a double effect on a key racial equity priority. That's not the typical project that we think about when we think about chief equity officers, and requires a much more holistic sense of like, what does it mean to do equity work in a city?
Kim, from your perspective, can you talk a little bit more about that as well?
One of those text messages,
Indeed.
I literally remember that day. I was in a meeting with our housing team, and it was like, I don't know, $3 million we went through just giving out rental assistance. And I literally asked one question to everyone in the room, and this is a room with like higher level cabinet folks. I say, do we know how many families applied for rental assistance twice or more? No one could answer it. No one could answer it. And I'm like, why don't we know that? Like, why don't we know the number of families that are applying for in this small amount of time? And we're going through millions of city dollars. And so with that conversation, it was around who's getting evicted, and then the societal indicator around even home ownership. And so with that particular project, taking a racial equity lens, it meant that we looked at the different way in which we communicated the several service providers around the rental assistance. The other part about that is we actually pulled in, turns out I like making random calls, a judge to give us access to, I convinced them to give Dr. Linos' team access. I laugh about it now because I don't know how to put that off. But we got access to the court evictions. And so there was a judicial order around monitoring the outcome and connecting the data around saying that rental assistance and then the actual share of evictions. And so the outcome became a larger conversation. And so the research around it allowed us to really change the way that our service provider provided rental assistance, but we kept our eye on bigger indicators like home ownership, because it was like, okay, once folks are now stable in their home, how do you then have other pathways towards home ownership, and other indicators came in. So I would say that that was one project that like rings near and true around when we saw the uptake increase, and then we could answer the question around how many folks, and then we had some clear outcomes. It really set the precedent for the way in which we could do hard things in government, and don't be scared of words like RCT. Use the economic imperative part of that. And so instead of using RCT, it was like, who needs our help? Who needs our help? And how do we make sure we're fiscally responsive in that time?
Marianne, can you talk us through how the Cradle-to-Career data system is supporting racial equity?
Sure. So we're fortunate that a focus on equity and racial equity is literally written into statute, our authorizing statute that created our office. And so it's a focus, a through line for all of our work. It's what the 21-person governing board that I report to holds me accountable for. So it drives our work. And I think one way that this has shaped our work is that our office was launched after a 2-year planning process that the governor's office spearheaded that involved over 100 public meetings and lots of engagement with the people who we'd expect would use this data system. So not just researchers, but also families, practitioners, decision makers. And I mention that because when you decide what to build, sounds very obvious, but it's useful to talk to people and ask them what they need before you do it. And so that's really driven how the data system is being built. If you look at the learning agenda that's on our website, the fact that we're not just creating a process for researchers to access the data, but we're really leading by and starting out with releasing public dashboards and a public create your own table tool so that everyone can dig into the data. And in that process, and over the last year and a half, one of the single most requested features is actually something that Dr. Towns highlighted yesterday, and that's the ability to disaggregate the data by race, ethnicity, and geography. Those three are the most requested features. And we know that because of all the work that's happened over the last few years, and because we were, again, required by statute to focus on user-centered design. So we're not going to be in a position of releasing our dashboard or putting together a query builder where after the fact we say, oh goodness, it would have been useful to give you the option to disaggregate by race and ethnicity. Shoot, I guess we'll start working on that now. Like, we know in advance that this is the thing people want the most. They want to know not just what's the picture statewide, like what does this look like in my community, right? So that's driving literally like the procurement we put out. Talk about procurements all day. It's driving every decision we make so that we can do that. I think the second part of this is about governance. And people talk like, what is governance? What does it mean? And I define this just as who gets to make the decisions and about what, right? So our governance is a little unwieldy. I'm not sure that I recommend having a 21-person governing board as your boss. It's a lot. And we also have two 16-person advisory boards who give recommendations to that governing board. So we have a lot of cooks in the kitchen. But again, in that statute that launched our office, there's a specific language about this governing board reflecting the diversity of California along multiple measures. And the fact that they're who's deciding, right? I report to them. They're the ones who ultimately decide what dashboards we can create and what they're going to look like. That really shapes the work that I do. And so I really love, the conversations we heard in the keynote today and all of these conversations yesterday and today about how we can proactively choose governance processes that really expand who is making the decisions about what we do, because it really strengthens the work.
I'm going to open it up to the panel again. This is going to be the common recurring question, which is how do we build capacity and the conditions for success within local government to do this work well?
I'll start us off, not that I have an answer, so hopefully my fellow panelists will know. I mean, one thing, when we were setting up the People Lab and then we moved the People Lab from one institution to another, we sat down as a team and said, okay, what are the core things that we value as a group? Because at some point that's going to end up mattering. And one of the core values that we had as a research team in an academic institution who cares a lot about rigorous research is that the work that we're doing is, in and of itself, investing in the capacity of local government. Now, that sounds obvious. However, for a very long time in the research community, there's been this slight disdain for government and government workers. Like, they don't understand, or let me explain it to them in simple language. There's this disdain that the people who work in government are either lazy or stupid, and if we just give them the good idea, they'll understand. And I think what that has led to is both kind of a lot of philanthropic dollars and research investment going to workarounds, right? So when I worked in government, we were kind of like, oh, we're going to work around the bureaucracy to solve the problem. That is a terrible idea, it turns out. And I think we're now at a place where building capacity in local government to do this kind of work means working directly with government and not around government, or not just creating opportunities to push government or hold government accountable, which of course is really, really important work. So I'm really excited that we're seeing more and more research, and JPAL research as well, in direct collaboration with these government agencies that have both the money and the mandate to actually deliver better services. I also think somehow we need to create an easier back and forth between people in academia and government. We're not there yet, of course, but I think there's opportunities to start building that more. So people who are now in research, who worked in government for many years, that's lived experience that is important in delivering these services, and the converse is true. So if you look at the alums of JPAL. JPAL has been around long enough that if you look across the country, some of the best work in state and local government is done by people who had the privilege and the luck of being part of this academic community. So the more we build that out and create those opportunities and celebrate that it's a great thing for researchers to go work in government, the more we can build that over time.
Yeah, I think the question of capacity is one that we have to ask. And I think for government folks, it's about being open to the fact that we can't solve these complex problems alone within our systems, because we actually need the help. And so with these offices across the country, it spans from 1 to about 20 folks, like in terms of equity offices. And so for me, having access to a research team allows me to get the support that I need to really ask complex questions and to allow them to bring in their complex thinking. And so I think the capacity conversation is about, I can't say it's not that government don't want to. I think it's what do you do and how do you operationalize equity? And what is the approach to doing so? So capacity is about really just unpacking some of that and then allowing different city departments to partner more with academic partners in a more thoughtful manner, to where we have the lived experience where it's not easy changing a policy in government. It's not easy changing a budget in government. And so part of the capacity, I think, from philanthropy is thinking about, like, these offices are not at scale in terms of the number of staff that we have. I have a small team. And so without Dr. Linos and her team, we couldn't do half the projects that we're trying to do. And so I think there's some real need to look at, like, what does the model, what does it look like to have an equity office that works across 13,000 employees in 30 departments? How many staff do you need? How do you move policy? And how do you do so in partnership with academic folks? And so I think those are all capacity questions that we need to answer to, because we're making policy. I'm working on some right now, and it's unwieldy. And so I'm always trying to slow folks down to say, wait, let me get my research team in this conversation. Let's get the data use agreement. So I think these are real things. So I think the more that we can say, what do we need on both sides? Local government, we only have small staff, right? So how do we partner to build that capacity to launch these impactful RCTs in a government structure?
So I have one quick response and then an answer to that. So first, I would just want to reinforce what Elizabeth said about the power of a network and people kind of growing into this work and then going off into government in different places. So I've managed to work with Elizabeth in each of my last 3 jobs. Rohit is another one. And there are a couple of people. There's another person I'm working with right now, the Department of Social Services, who was a very early employee of the Government Performance Lab. And so the impact of that is not trivial, and I just want to emphasize that. My other answer to this on capacity and how do we enable this is one I wouldn't have given 2 years ago. And that's thinking about the power of legislation and changes in the law to enable this. And what I mean by that is I'm incredibly fortunate to be building a data system that is not just being spun off as an initiative of the governor's office, but was established in legislation. So when people ask, how are you able to link in the unemployment insurance data so that we can look at whether these efforts are helping people earn living wages, the answer is California changed code, like literally passed legislation that says, and here's why the earnings data can come to the Cradle-to-Career data system. There's very specific language, it's many pages long, that established our office, and some of that was around governance, user-centered design, how we're going to run this thing, but a lot of it was also very carefully crafted by lawyers who were looking to make it possible to think about, if we're thinking about health data, education data, earnings data, what do we need to change in the California code to make this possible? Not many governors say the word state longitudinal data system on the campaign trail, so perhaps we had like a unique opportunity in California, but it's not the only place where this is happening. So the data quality campaign is actually tracking and sharing information about multiple states that are considering similar legislation. So previously in my work, I would have thought of legislation as something that just exists as a constraint, and you have to kind of work within it or around it. But your example where you literally had a judicial order that enabled her team to do work, like those possibilities are there, and to really think about what can be done. And even within what already exists, I mean, people like Judd, who are pretty, sorry to call you out, but the Treasury's putting out, has, I believe, put out really interesting information with OMB on some of the Recovery Act dollars, how those can be spent, OMB guidance around the Evidence Act. If you can work with your lawyers, I've spent more time talking with lawyers over the last year and a half than I am the rest of my life combined, to look at those examples for permission. Everyone loves an example. No one wants to be the one who invented the language. But if you can point to another example that says, yep, this has been done, this is permissible, this is legal, it really opens it up.
Marion, I want to come back to you on this topic of bringing community in. And you had talked a little bit about how you were able to do community hearings on the Cradle-to-Career program. Can you walk us through what that process looks like and how practically community's voice has been brought in? We talked about government, we talked about academia, we talked about some of the processes, but community voice is just as important here. And how do we kind of leverage community voice that's available and bringing that voice into this process really deliberately and intentionally?
Thank you for that. So I think the most important aspect of that I already mentioned, which is thinking about the big picture governance structure and who actually has a vote, who's deciding, making these decisions. In addition to that, with the data system, we've done this in two ways. One is kind of the classic, we're subject to California's open meeting laws. So anytime that 3 or more of my governing board members have a conversation, it's a publicly noticed public meeting where anyone can join and tell us what they think. So that's definitely there, and we've made a decision to continue let people provide public comment over Zoom. So it's not just those with the resources to show up in Sacramento. But that's only a small subset of the voices we want to hear. And so we also host informal, what we call community conversations. We had touch points with over 500 people through that mechanism over the last year alone. And then it's also taking a page out of the product design playbook from software development and other fields, which is if I know that I'm trying to create something that helps people navigate the transition from high school to college, and I know that they're not going to show up and listen to my public meeting, I can use that knowledge to go out and find them and leverage the people on my advisory board, leverage the advocacy and equity organizations who are watching our work and ensuring we're doing what we promised, to find people where they're at in their community, sit down with them and say, how's this working for you? Let me sit with you. Let me watch you play with this dashboard or whatever it is that we're prototyping, and kind of proactively go out and find people, not just waiting for people to show up at a public meeting that we host. So user-centered design is really at the heart of how we're approaching a lot of that, with a hope that we create stuff that people actually use.
Can I add just one
Please.
thing? Just one thing to add on that is that's become a research question, I think, for a lot of us as well, which is how do you take all the good models that we can do that are hyper-localized and really rich in terms of bringing up community voice or user-centered design, and think about that at scale. So one thing that is an unanswered question that hopefully someone in this room is going to answer is if local government does do community engagement efforts and tries to bring community voice into decision-making, whether it's participatory budgeting or town hall processes, and the people who show up are, on average, retired white women, what does that mean about testing new approaches to proactively do community engagement so that then that can be a representative voice of the community and therefore can be used for decision making? Because you can imagine that leading us down a very different path if we're not really focused on that as an empirical question as well.
Kim, same question. What's worked when you're in across Denver and San Diego? What's been successful in bringing community together?
Well, I think for our team, we actually have a community engagement bucket of funding. And so one thing that I'm excited about is that we're actually going to fund organizations to look at partnering with our departments to work on common strategies in their equity plan. And so we know that we don't always have access to the individuals. And so working with the organizations, they have quicker and inclusive access. And so I think what's working for us is looking at our equity plan structure as a way to invite organizations to, tackle complexities as a unit. And I think to Dr. Linos' point around local government folks can usurp and be transactional with community engagement, where we have 1.4 million folks. So how do you say that this group of, 100 people have informed a policy in a neighborhood where they don't even live at? And so my team has actually had to stop some of those particular policies because it was like, how do you give feedback for structural inequity when you don't even live and exist in the ecosystem of inequity? And so I think you got to be I love the way you frame that, in that you got to solve for the empirical question around how do you actually do inclusive community engagement? And I kind of caution saying things like the community will inform the policy. And I believe, and I'll just close with this in terms of the pedagogy of the oppressed, is that the moment where you say that you are speaking for entire community is when you start oppressing them. And so with government policies, you got to be real careful with that, because it's not enough folks who, when you say inform the policy, I've had directors say to me, yeah, we're like, give me that survey back. And it's like, all white, middle-class women informed a structural disparity in a neighborhood where we have the majority of people of color who don't have rec center access. How do you give context to that? So I'm interested in the empirical question around how do you measure it more? But for us, it's funding organizations to help us tackle that as a unit.
Great. So we want to open up to the room for any questions. Same as before, we have a mic. Please raise your hand.
Hey, Zach Markovitz, Results for America. A great panel. This is awesome. I have 1,000 questions. But the one I asked is actually something I was going to ask Dr. Bertrand last night, and you guys sort of brought up again. She had it was a question about advice to young researchers, and one of the things was like, engage more in doing these kinds of RCTs that really have practical application. And Dr. Linos, you mentioned when you were a grad student getting pushed away from RCTs and just have more dialogue between academics and the public sector. Marianne, you said you mentioned it was like risky, right, to partner in public sector. I think these are all really good points. I'm really interested in misaligned incentives here, and where incentives in academia is about publish, and incentives in the public sector is getting solutions to the problem. And oh, by the way, Dr. Linos, your research is saying that it better be a part of an existing process that we have, otherwise it won't continue. And so I'd love to know your thoughts on Dr. Bertrand's advice, or maybe put a different way, what advice would you give to a young, a burgeoning researcher who wants to do the kind of great work that JPAL is espousing in this field, or maybe Kim on your end, or Marianne in your current role, for a young person in government that doesn't see the incentives lining up, but wants to bring evidence-based policy into their practice?
I can start. I think there's tremendous potential, especially at the state level, you can speak to the local level, for a relatively small number of interested and dedicated people to be able to influence things, perhaps incrementally, but just the possibilities of saying, you know what, like one of the ideas I'd love to implement is have a virtual brown bag session with our team and others in government who want to listen to research and learn from it. That's so doable. It's something we can set up. And small seeds like that can help create an ecosystem where it becomes easier for people to form these relationships, form the trusting relationships, and figure out how to align the incentives. I'm not an academic, so I don't know. I'm actually a bit more optimistic that incentives can more often be aligned than we think they might be able to. I actually think it's a great strength of academia to be independent from the political cycle, and that there's a real reason why we should often try to partner on research studies that aren't done in-house and that are done by those on the outside. So I think instead of focusing on where incentives don't align, I like to look for like the puzzle of like, when can they align enough to get done what we'd like to? But I mean, I'll just close with an anecdote. When I wasn't planning to leave OMB when I did, and thought that the opportunity in California was one of these once-in-a-career rare moments to create a shift in what would be possible with data and evidence. And when I talked to the person I work most closely with in the governor's office and basically said, like, does this have the support it needs to really get to where it's going to go? One of the things he mentioned is that, again, going back to where I started, in state government in the US, that's where a lot of the social policy levers are pulled. And in contrast to DC, which always has such a wide range of people, everyone wants to go to DC to get the next job. when you're in state government, there's a tremendous opportunity for people to join, stay, and really get work done, still at a tremendous scale, regardless of whether it's a large or a small state, and to really have an impact where the decisions that you can make as an individual, even within a large bureaucracy, can really shift things in one direction or another. So that's my plug for doing at least a long or short stint in government if you want to have impact.
Yeah, I think mine would be simple. There are no simplistic solutions for complex structures and systems. And so I see a lot of folks fail in government where they come in oversimplifying, saying, just do this and it's done. To get the rental assistance project launched with the racial equity lens, it took a lot of up, down, back, forward. And so I think sometimes folks come into government or even partnering with academic folks where they're like, just do this. And I'm like, I have to have 42 meetings just to get this one thing done. And there are things that I didn't even know. And so I think that it's really, it's actually, it can land in a very negative way when you come in with a very simplistic solution for a complex system. And so I would say the advice is to like take a step back and say, we're dealing with historic, systemic design inequity. And so be cautious of being over simplistic with your approach. I would say be empirical and evidence-based is the better way to take that. Because I see a lot of folks fail in government and academic partners fall through, or when you're trying to oversimplify a complex issue where it's like to get a judicial order, to get a data use agreement, to get the mayor to agree, to get housing to agree, it was like 3 ulcers and late nights. That's not written in textbooks, right? So all that to say is don't oversimplify and try to pull in all the experience in the room, especially if you're a novice at the space. I'm just now being effective at 11 years in 2 government structures. It took me that long to know, what does this model even say, you know?
Yeah, I think the same thing applies from the research perspective. It's still funny to me that I can have a research opinion for young researchers, because in my mind, I'm 27 and just starting. But I do think there's something really fundamental about all the, especially for people who want to do RCTs, which is a lot of us, all the pieces that have to happen for you to get a nice bar chart at the end that take years of building relationships. And so like Kim was mentioning the DUA because we're currently gouging our eyes out on a few. Just setting up a DUA might take 2 years. So if I'm a young researcher and I'm doing a PhD, okay, 3 years.
It's been 1 year so far. We go, you know.
1 year so far. If I'm a young researcher, the misalignment in incentives and when I need to get out of my program suggests that that's a terrible thing to do by yourself. But JPAL was set up and taught a lot of us how to set up those kinds of infrastructures to be able to provide that kind of infrastructure. So a PhD student that's coming to my lab now starts like with a 5-year like a running phase where we've built that DUA, we've built that relationship, we know the people, and they're just coming in doing their RCT and getting out. And I think that's okay when it's your first researcher. I expect that all of us who have done that a few times and have benefited from the privilege of JPAL PIs, because you know who was doing this 10 years ago, it was just JPAL, are now going to pay it forward by providing that infrastructure for new researchers. But we don't talk about that investment enough. And so people get frustrated and impatient and say, well, I tried to do a data use agreement and they said no. And I'm like, first no is nothing compared to this. You know?
On the 10th,
So I really think that infrastructure is really important. And we haven't talked about it enough at this conference so far. The JPAL staff, beyond the researchers that are building those networks, maintaining those relationships, allow for that to happen. So I'm going to call you out, Rohit. You know, when I talked to Rohit one day and he said, hey, there's this really interesting team in Minnesota that wants to do this project. You're interested in this topic and made that match. That saved me 4 years, right? Because that was already built there. I would have never met those people. And so that infrastructure allows a young researcher to plug in. And vice versa, when you're a young person in government, if there's an office and a set of mentors like Marianne and Kim to say this is what it looks like to do data-driven work in government, you're plugging into a system that already exists. And that, I think, is the only way to do it, I think. But I'll let you know.
Great.
Yeah.
I do think one of our big missions at JPAL is to build the infrastructure to make it easier for young researchers. There's been a lot of talk about the challenges of doing research in general, research and policy research, especially with the young. But I just want to emphasize that I think one of the reasons it's so important that we do this work of building the infrastructure, which does disproportionately support the new and the young researchers, is that they have something that us older researchers with, yes, Elizabeth, yeah, near elderly, Matt's telling me, with all of our experience, wisdom, et cetera, that we can hopefully guide them with, they have two things that I at least lack. First of all, I'm always awed by the sort of positive energy and enthusiasm of my students. I look at a potential project and I see all the pitfalls that are going to come. They don't yet see them, and that's often a good thing, right? Because it gives them, no, I'm serious. Like, I don't think I would have ever done the Oregon experiment if I'd known what I was getting into. I'm glad I did. And the second is they bring in fresh perspectives, especially as we increasingly reach out and try to reach out to a broader set of researchers with different experiences and different backgrounds, and they ask new questions. So I just wanted to say, there's been a lot of it's hard for researchers, it's hard for young researchers, and I don't mean to denigrate any of that, but it's our mission to make it easy for you because that's the future.
Yeah, Amy, I want to respond to that in a way based on your data point with 265 researchers. If you were to Dr. Linos' point, to scale government with over 400 cities where those researchers can jump into those projects where you already have data use agreements in place, it makes my job easier. And so scalability-wise is that you got to get these local government offices strong so that way when you have the plethora of projects, because we need the help, and so you got to scale government to be ready with the data use agreements, then we'll take all your researchers. I could tell you, Dr. Linos is giving me teams of folks. And so I think your question is spot on, is that we want to utilize the researchers, the 265, but to do that, we have to have the support in the local government to know even how to construct a data use agreement. And what that means in partnership with 30 departments to do RCTs. And so I think it's neutrality in that around scalability.
We have time for one more question. Looks like we have a hand up there.
Dr. Linos, you mentioned from the outset this challenge of average treatment effect, right? That our existing evidence does not always talk about the populations that we care about the most and the importance of these programs in limiting disparities. Can you just talk a little bit, though, about in practice what that means for you in selecting projects where you could disaggregate data to look at average treatment effects? And what do you do in the projects where you really want to look at a subpopulation but you don't have the sample? And I'm thinking in particular, intersectionality, where it almost is impossible to get the sample you want. How are you guys thinking about those things?
With pain in our hearts is how we're thinking about it. I mean, it is, and this came up, earlier when Laura Arnold was talking as well. This is a trade-off that all of us face, which is we really want to do rigorous work. And for those of us who do RCTs, as you know, we have lots of good ideas is not the problem. Sample size is usually the bane of our existence, right? And so I guess for a long time we would just say, this is the average treatment effect, and future studies will show yada yada heterogeneous treatment effects. I think we've hit the max on how many times we can say that as a community. In the same way that before that we would do really interesting research and then we had one slide at the end that would say, and policy implications, right? So I think we're just kind of in a new era of this work where it's not enough to say, oh, I wasn't powered. Because you wouldn't underpower a study for an average treatment effect, right? We make decisions, trade-offs about what project we can study and with what population. So I think we just have to be much more active in thinking about, I'm going to call it heterogeneous treatment effects. I just mean if we care about if the policymaker cares about the effect on one population, it's not good enough for the research community to spend millions of dollars to answer a different question. And so being responsive to what the government is actually asking changes the kinds of research questions that we should be taking on. Now, this is only possible in certain areas right now, but I think it is part of what should be expected moving forward, especially for some of the questions that we're talking about, whether it's administrative burden or equity work or general service delivery. If we want our research to be relevant to policymakers and we want adoption at scale, we have to provide the answer that policymakers are asking. Otherwise, we're talking on different playing fields. So That's a high horse answer, but it's still a sample size problem. So, we'll solve that one project at a time. But I guess it's just not good enough to not try, is where I think we are.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. A special thank you to our panel for being here and for answering all of our questions and for giving us their insights, and to the audience for being such a great audience. Thank you all.
Thank you. Also, a very big thank you to Stan John for your wonderful moderation, and of course to the panel again. We are going to move on to another panel, so it's a very short break while we just swap folks in and out. And I promise there is a break after the next session. We will not hold you hostage forever.